Well, live now to Ravi Agrawal, Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy, who's joining us, we believe, this evening. Ravi, great to have you with us once again. I just want to begin by getting your assessment on the events of the past, 12 hours of what we're witnessing here.
Well, it's awful all round, isn't it? I mean, the internet has been cut off. Cellular service is off now within Gaza. And what we're witnessing really is immense humanitarian distress amid the fog of war, with Israel, at this point at least, not fully confirming whether it has commenced a ground operation or a ground invasion of Gaza, but it has heavily escalated its siege of Gaza and its advance into Gaza. There have been tanks that have been going in and out over the last 2 days now. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has signaled that a ground invasion is imminent at some point soon. And amid all of this, of course, the 200 plus hostages that remain scattered around Gaza, we believe, kept by Hamas, wondering whether they will see safety and the light of day and be returned to their loved ones at the end of this. So this is incredibly fraught. And as your correspondent just pointed out, the weight of world opinion isn't falling clearly in any one direction. The world is quite divided in how it should try and help alleviate the situation as Israel responds to what we must add was an awful, terrible attack on October 7 by Hamas.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the weight of opinion here, because you mentioned that heavy escalation, which we're now seeing, the White House calling for humanitarian pauses in certain areas, a UN resolution today as well. Do you think that that will carry any weight?
I'm afraid not. It's hard to see how that works. It's hard to see how Israel would implement it. It's hard to see how, when you have the kind of siege situation that you have in the current moment, without internet, without cellular connections, where you have the Palestinian Aid Agency of the UN has lost contact with its people on the ground. The UN has lost contact with its people on the ground. It's very hard to see how to organize a humanitarian sort of rescue corridor to allow for sort of the last 100-meter delivery of aid and assistance to the people who need it most. The situation is quite dire, of course, and it's hard to see a way out of that unless the siege itself ends and unless Hamas gives up these hostages, which I'm sure is one of the things that Israel is very concerned about at this point.
Ravi, you point to the fact that it is a very dire situation already for this upped operation to be taking place in. Do you think the United States anticipated it happening at a time when there were so many unknowns, so many loose threads, as it were, just so many dire circumstances?
It didn't. Israel didn't, clearly. This was a massive intelligence failure on Israel's part. And it was also an intelligence failure on America's part. And America, for the longest time, has been trying to pivot away from the Middle East, from the crises of the Middle East, for well over 15 years now, to try and engage more with Asia. And every time it tries to do that, it somehow ends up being dragged back in, whether it was the Arab Spring protests of 2011, whether it was the war in Ukraine, which began 21 months ago and forced it to turn its attention elsewhere yet again, or whether there were other crises in the Middle East that dragged it back into the region. And so America keeps trying to have a more diversified portfolio in its foreign policy. But the Middle East has just been this long, persistent problem. And at the heart of it really is exactly this, what we're seeing, a long-running conflict between two people and two lands and two religions that so much effort, diplomatic effort, went into it to solve it, but it's been lying dormant for all these years.
Well, on that point, we know that Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier Pat Ryder had said that there will be 900 more US troops deployed to the region. What do you make of that? Does that signal anything, any further US involvement in the region?
Well, I think America's trying to make a very clear signal to Israel, just to say we are there, we are your ally, we've got your back, we're here for you. That's number one, and that's why U.S. President Joe Biden went there all the way to visit. Um, but beyond that, I think the secondary role of the United States in that region right now is to prevent things from escalating. So to make sure that other fronts, newer fronts to the war don't open up, that Hezbollah to the north isn't emboldened enough to escalate and open up a new front to the war, that Iranian proxies, and remember Hamas is an Iranian proxy, that other Iranian proxies don't try to create any mischief in a moment of weakness for Israel. So America's role is very much to try and stabilize. And then finally, I would say behind the scenes, to try and advise Israel on how to deal with this situation, not only the hostage negotiations, and the third parties involved in trying to help out there, Qatar and others, but also America's own experience after 9/11 with the war on terror, which lasted the better part of 20 years. Part of America's role here as well is to tell Israel, don't make the same mistakes America made. Don't get mired in things you can't get out of. In other words, have a plan, have a clear vision for what the next 3 or 4 days, 3 or 4 weeks look like. If you're going to go in, figure out how to get out and figure out what happens next. That's crucial here.
Do you think that plan is there? As you said, President Biden saying don't make the same mistakes of Iraq and not have a clear plan for what happens if the enemy, quote unquote, is defeated. Do you think that's clear? And a huge question to you, but right now, what do you think this means for any possibility of the two-state solution?
Yeah, so it is not clear to me that there is a plan. And every time we've tried to ask Israeli officials, they have quite rightly said that if they did have a plan, they wouldn't divulge it to the world, which makes sense. They should be saying that. But anecdotally and behind the scenes, it isn't clear that they have a clear vision for how to release those hostages who are also under fire right now in the aerial bombardment of Gaza, who are also in this horrible, dire humanitarian situation. Second, if they go in, what happens next? Is it even possible to eliminate Hamas? Is it even possible, were you to do that, to imagine what replaces them? These are all tough, complicated questions that are mired in, a region and a land that is mired in a history of problems. It's not going to be easy. Revenge is not the answer. Vengeance isn't a policy. What happened to Israel, of course, is just beyond awful. It's unthinkable. But there has to be a plan. And I think the saving grace of this is that, over the last 3 weeks, Israel hasn't just gone in on day one. They've waited. But again, the clock is ticking because with each passing day, releasing those hostages becomes harder. And then the death toll in Gaza has continued to rise. So in many ways, this has just been an unwinnable situation for all parties, and awfulness all round.
Just to touch on something you said there about defeating Hamas, President Biden has been very clear. Not all Palestinian people are Hamas or support Hamas. But in light of what people have been going through there in the Gaza Strip, how too do you also defeat an idea like Hamas? That's a huge question, isn't it?
It is. It's an idea. It's also a political party that won an election. It is also what many would call a terrorist group. How do you defeat it when it's spread out all over that region? They're not easily identifiable. Some of them live abroad. Its leader lives in Doha, in Qatar. It is not going to be easy to define how to eliminate them. I mean, what does that even mean? What is the end state goal? And we know from the history of militant groups around the world, you don't just eliminate them. Sometimes it's like whack-a-mole where, were you to take out one big leader, other offsprings or offshoots can arise elsewhere. New leaders emerge. So it's not as simple as that. And you asked about the two-state solution, and I didn't quite answer you then, but the ultimate final solution to this has to be some way for these two people to live together, some form, some way for them to share that territory in a way that is organized and settled, that the two agree on. And that is really, in the longer term, the only way we can imagine how to fix this very intractable historic problem. And for that, it's hard to imagine it in this moment. But for creative people, for diplomats on both sides, it's really important to begin that process of moving towards that. The worse the current moment of bloodshed is, the harder it is to get to that moment where you can imagine peace.
Ravi Agrawal, Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy. Always great to have you on, Ravi. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.